The rain was falling hard on the streets of Chicago that evening, and everything looked like a blur of car lights and wet roads, reflecting them back into the sky above the city, where thousands of people lived and worked and went about their daily lives without knowing what was about to happen on this particular night that would change two men forever, in ways neither of them could have imagined when they woke up that morning thinking it would be just another ordinary day in their ordinary lives. But fate had other plans for both of them, and those plans would begin with a simple encounter on a rainy street in a neighborhood where one man belonged and the other man thought he did not. Officer Gregory Palmer sat in his patrol car with his jaw tight and his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too hard because he was frustrated about something he could not quite name, but felt deep in his chest like a weight that pressed down on him every single day since he joined the police force 3 years ago, when he thought he would make a real difference in the world and help people who needed help. But instead, he found himself driving around neighborhoods looking for problems that might not even exist, and second-guessing every decision he made while wondering if this was really what he signed up for when he took the oath to serve and protect. That was when he saw the old man walking slowly down the sidewalk with a slight limp in his right leg that made each step look painful. But the man kept walking anyway, like he had somewhere important to be, even though the rain was soaking through his old jacket and dripping from his gray hair down onto his worn briefcase that looked like it had seen better days many years ago, when everything was new and the world was full of promise for a young man starting his career and building his life. The old man was black, and this was Lincoln Park, which was a wealthy neighborhood where most people were white and had expensive cars and nice houses, and Gregory felt something stir in his chest when he saw the old man walking there like he did not belong, even though Gregory would never have said that out loud or even admitted it to himself because he did not think he was that kind of person. But his hand moved to his radio before his brain could catch up and tell him to think about what he was doing and why he was doing it. The old man noticed the police car pulling up beside him, and he stopped walking and turned to face it with rainwater running down his face and soaking into his clothes. But his expression remained calm and measured, like he had been in situations like this before, and knew exactly how to handle them, even though this time felt different somehow in ways he could not quite explain but could feel in the air between him and the young officer, who was now getting out of his car. His name was Lawrence Hughes, though the officer did not know that yet, and did not know that Lawrence had spent 32 years working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, hunting down some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and saving lives, and making the world a safer place, one case at a time, with dedication and skill that earned him respect from colleagues and fear from enemies who knew his name and what it meant when Lawrence Hughes was on their trail. Gregory stepped out of his car and his hand rested on his belt near his weapon, which was a gesture that law enforcement officers made without thinking when they felt uncertain or threatened. But Lawrence noticed it immediately because his trained eyes took in everything about the young officer in just a few seconds, including his posture and his expression and the way his fingers twitched slightly like he was nervous about something that had not happened yet, but might happen soon if things went wrong. "Can I help you, officer?" Lawrence asked in a voice that was calm and steady, despite the rain and the cold, and the situation that was developing between them on this dark street, where no one else seemed to be around to witness what was about to unfold, and maybe prevent it from going too far. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Gregory demanded as he stepped closer to Lawrence with his shoulders squared and his voice harder than it needed to be, because he was trying to sound authoritative and in control even though something inside him was whispering that this was wrong and he should just let the old man go about his business. Walking home, Lawrence replied with a simple gesture toward the apartment building that stood half a block away where he had lived for the past 5 years since he moved to Chicago after retiring from the FBI and starting a new chapter in his life as a consultant and lecturer who tried to share his knowledge with the next generation of law enforcement officers who might benefit from his experience. "I live here," Lawrence added, but Gregory barely seemed to hear him because his mind was already made up about what was happening here, even though he had no evidence and no reason to suspect anything, except the color of the old man's skin and the fact that he looked out of place in this neighborhood, where people like him supposedly did not belong. "Right?" Gregory said with obvious disbelief in his voice as he held out his hand and demanded to see some identification, which Lawrence provided without argument because he knew how these situations Worked, and he knew that resistance would only make things worse, even though he also knew that he had done nothing wrong and had every right to walk down the street in his own neighborhood without being stopped and questioned. Lawrence reached slowly into his jacket with movements that were careful and deliberate, because years of training had taught him that sudden movements could be misinterpreted and lead to tragedy. So he moved like he was underwater, with everything happening in slow motion. While Gregory watched him with suspicious eyes and one hand hovering near his weapon, he pulled out his wallet and extracted his driver's license and handed it over to Gregory, who took it and glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before handing it back without really looking at the address that clearly showed Lawrence lived exactly where he said he lived, just half a block away in the building that was visible from where they stood. Something about the old man's calm demeanor irritated Gregory, in a way he could not explain, because it felt like Lawrence was judging him or looking down on him, even though Lawrence had said nothing disrespectful and had done everything Gregory asked without complaint or argument. "What is in the briefcase?" Gregory asked next, and his voice had an edge to it now that had not been there before, because he was doubling down on his initial instinct, even though every piece of evidence suggested he was wrong and should apologize and let this man go home. "Personal items," Lawrence replied evenly, and his voice remained calm. But something in his eyes had changed, because he understood now that this young officer was not going to let this go, and was not going to treat him with the basic respect that every human being deserved, regardless of their age or race or appearance. "Open it," Gregory ordered. And now his hand moved closer to his weapon, and his stance became more aggressive, as if he expected Lawrence to suddenly transform into some kind of dangerous criminal who needed to be subdued with force. For the first time, Lawrence hesitated, because inside his briefcase were items he had carried with him since his retirement 3 months ago, including commendations from 3 different FBI directors, and letters thanking him for his service, and photographs showing him with presidents and other important people, and his retired FBI credentials that proved he had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting people and upholding the law that this young officer was now using against him. "Officer, I have shown you my identification, and I have told you where I live, and there is no reasonable suspicion to justify searching my personal belongings," Lawrence said carefully, because he knew the law better than most people, and he knew that what Gregory was doing was not legal or justified, but he also knew that pointing this out might make the situation worse. "I said open it," Gregory shouted, and his hand was now fully on his weapon, and his face was red with anger or embarrassment or fear, or maybe all 3 at once, because he had committed himself to this course of action and could not back down now without looking weak or foolish. Lawrence looked at this young officer who reminded him of so many other people he had encountered over the years who let fear and prejudice guide their actions instead of reason and compassion, and he felt a different kind of anger than he usually felt, because he had faced down mob bosses and terrorists and serial killers, but standing here in the rain being threatened by a young officer who only saw his skin color felt worse. "Somehow, I am not opening my briefcase," Lawrence said firmly, and his voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it now as he continued, "And if you want to detain me, you will need to articulate a valid reason based on evidence and reasonable suspicion, not just your assumptions about who belongs in this neighborhood." What happened next would be recorded by 3 different security cameras mounted on nearby buildings, and would be uploaded to the internet within the hour, where millions of people would watch it and share it and argue about it and use it as fuel for their existing beliefs about police and race and justice in America. Gregory grabbed Lawrence's arm roughly and spun him around and pushed him against the patrol car with more force than was necessary, and the briefcase fell from Lawrence's hand and hit the wet pavement and popped open, and its contents spilled out onto the street, where the rain immediately began to blur the ink on some of the papers. Gregory's grip loosened on Lawrence's shoulder as his eyes moved from one document to another, scattered across the wet pavement, and the rain kept falling, making the ink run on some of the papers, but the gold FBI seal was still clearly visible, and so was the signature of the President of the United States, and so were the commendations and awards, and all the proof that this man was not who Gregory had assumed he was, but was instead someone who had spent his entire life serving his country and protecting people and upholding the very laws that Gregory had just violated, sir. Gregory started to say, but his voice cracked and broke, because he could not find the words to express what he was feeling or to explain what he had done, or to make the situation any better than it was, and his training had not prepared him for this moment, when he had to face the consequences of his own prejudice and fear. Lawrence straightened slowly, and his shoulder ached where he had been shoved against the car, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the disappointment he felt as he looked at this young officer who had so much potential, but had let his biases control his actions, and had failed to see another human being standing in front of him asking for nothing more than basic dignity and respect. "You can let go now," Lawrence said quietly, and his voice was calm. But there was something in it that made Gregory step back immediately and release his grip as if he had been burned. Gregory knelt down on the wet pavement and started frantically gathering the scattered documents with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold on to the papers. And his mind was racing with thoughts about his career and his future. And what would happen when this video went viral and everyone saw what he had done? He picked up a commendation for bravery and a letter thanking Lawrence for his service in breaking up a domestic terror cell, and a photograph of Lawrence receiving the Medal of Valor from the FBI director, and each document felt heavier than the last as the weight of his mistake pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Mr. Hughes, I am so sorry, I did not know," Gregory said as he stood up with the damp papers in his hands, but the words sounded hollow and meaningless even to his own ears. "That is the problem," Lawrence said, and his voice was steady. But there was steel beneath it that came from decades of dealing with criminals and corrupt officials and people who thought they were above the law. And he continued saying, "You did not need to know who I am, and you should have treated me with basic human dignity regardless of my name or my career or my accomplishments, because every person deserves." That a crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk and in doorways, and people were holding up their phones, recording everything and murmuring to each other about what they had just witnessed, and Gregory could feel dozens of eyes watching him and judging him, and he knew that within minutes this video would be everywhere. The phones were already uploading the footage to social media, where it would be shared thousands of times and commented on by millions of people who would form their opinions based on this one moment without knowing anything about Gregory or his background, or the good things he had tried to do in his 3 years as an officer. "Please," Gregory said, and his voice was desperate now as he stood there with the wet documents still in his hands, and he continued saying, "Let me make this right somehow," even though he had no idea how that would be possible. Lawrence took the documents from him and carefully placed them back in his briefcase, and the silence between them stretched out uncomfortably while the rain continued to fall and the crowd continued to watch and record, and Gregory felt like he was drowning in his own shame. A woman from the crowd called out, and her voice was sharp with anger as she demanded that Gregory be fired and arrested and punished for what he had done. And other voices joined hers, creating a chorus of outrage that filled the street. But Lawrence raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent, because there was something about his presence that commanded respect even without his FBI credentials, and even in this moment when he had every right to be angry and vengeful. "No," Lawrence said to the crowd, and his voice carried across the street with authority, and he continued saying, "This young man made a mistake, and it was a serious one, but I have seen enough hatred in my life, and I will not add to it by demanding revenge." The crowd seemed confused by his response because they expected him to be angry and to demand justice, but instead, he was showing mercy to someone who probably did not deserve it, and Gregory stood there in shock, unable to believe what he was hearing. Lawrence turned back to Gregory, who was frozen in place with tears starting to form in his eyes, because he had not cried since he was a child, but the overwhelming emotions of this moment were too much to hold back. "What is your name?" Officer Lawrence asked, and his tone was not harsh, but it was not friendly either, and it carried the weight of all his years of experience and wisdom. "Gregory Palmer, sir." Gregory replied, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Gregory," Lawrence said, and he spoke slowly and deliberately, so that every word would sink in and be remembered, and he continued saying, "You wore a uniform for 3 years, and I wore one for 32, and we both swore to protect people. And that means all people regardless of their color or their background or where they live. And you need to remember that." Gregory nodded but could not speak because his throat was tight with emotion and shame, and he knew that Lawrence was right and that he had violated the very oath he had taken when he became a police officer. Lawrence turned to walk away toward his apartment building, But then he paused and reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card that he had made for his consulting work after retirement. And the card was simple, with just his name and title and phone number. He handed the card to Gregory, who took it with trembling hands and looked down at it, not understanding why Lawrence would give him his contact information after everything that had just happened. "If you are serious about learning and about being better, then call me," Lawrence said. And his eyes held Gregory's gaze for a long moment before he added, "But understand that this might be your last chance to choose the kind of officer and the kind of man you want to be." With that, Lawrence walked away through the rain toward his building and left Gregory standing there in the street with the business card in his hand, and the eyes of the crowd still watching him, and the weight of his mistake pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the phones kept recording, and the videos kept uploading, and within an hour the footage would have millions of views, and Gregory's name would be everywhere, along with demands for his termination and prosecution. Gregory got back into his patrol car and sat there for a long time with the rain drumming on the roof and the business card clutched in his hand, and he tried to process what had just happened and what it meant for his future. His radio crackled to life and the dispatcher was calling for him, but he could not bring himself to respond because he knew that when he returned to the precinct, his life as he knew it would be over and everything would change. But even as he sat there in despair, a small voice in the back of his mind kept reminding him of Lawrence's words about having a chance to choose who he wanted to be, and that maybe this terrible mistake could become an opportunity for growth if he had the courage to face it. The business card in his hand felt like both a lifeline and a challenge, because accepting Lawrence's help would mean admitting how wrong he had been and confronting the biases he had never wanted to acknowledge. But ignoring it would mean staying the same person who had made this terrible mistake in the first place. Gregory finally started the car and drove back to the precinct, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead of him, and that this rainy night in Chicago had changed everything about his life and his future and his understanding of himself and the work he had chosen to do. By the time Gregory Palmer returned to the precinct, the video had already gone viral and his phone was buzzing constantly with notifications and messages and calls from numbers he did not recognize, and most of them were from reporters or angry citizens demanding that he be fired immediately. The Chicago Police Department's social media accounts were being flooded with thousands of comments and shares, and the hashtag about the incident was trending nationally with people from all over the country weighing in with their opinions about what should happen to the officer who had assaulted an elderly FBI legend. Captain Daniel Morris was waiting in his office when Gregory arrived, and the captain's face was grave and tired, like he had aged 10 years in the past hour since the video started spreading, and he gestured for Gregory to sit down without saying a word. The captain was a 20-year veteran of the force, and he was African American, and someone Gregory had always respected and looked up to. But now meeting his eyes felt impossible because Gregory knew he had disappointed this man who had mentored him and believed in him. "Sit down, Palmer," Captain Morris said, and his voice was carefully controlled, like he was holding back anger or disappointment, or maybe both at once. Gregory sat in the chair across from the captain's desk, and Lawrence's business card was still clutched in his hand, and the captain's office felt smaller than usual, like the walls were closing in around him. "Do you know who Lawrence Hughes is?" the captain asked, and it was not really a question but more of a statement. "I know now," Sir Gregory replied quietly and added, "I saw his credentials and the commendations and everything else. Then let me tell you what those credentials do not show," Captain Morris said as he pulled up a file on his computer and began to read from it with a voice that grew harder with each sentence. Lawrence Hughes led the task force that took down the West Side Syndicate in 1998, and it involved 11 different agencies across 4 states and 18 months of dangerous undercover work, and he personally negotiated the surrender of Vincent Calabrese, which prevented a shootout that could have killed dozens of innocent people. Gregory felt his stomach twist into knots as he listened, and he wanted to disappear or go back in time and undo everything he had done, but he knew that was impossible. In 2003, he broke up a human trafficking ring that had been operating for 15 years, and he saved 43 children from unspeakable horrors, and he got shot twice in the process, but still managed to testify at the trial and put away everyone involved. The captain continued. "Captain I. Gregory started to say, but the captain held up his hand to silence him. "I am not finished," Captain Morris said, and leaned forward with his eyes boring into Gregory, and continued saying, "In 2010, Lawrence Hughes stopped a domestic terror attack on the subway system, and the kind of attack that would have killed hundreds of people during rush hour. And he did it with intelligence and courage and dedication to protecting innocent lives." The silence in the office was deafening, and Gregory could hear his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears like a drum that would not stop. Lawrence Hughes has trained half the agents currently in the FBI's Chicago field office, and he has lectured at Quantico and consulted on cases for Interpol, and 3 different presidents have personally thanked him for his service, the captain said, and then added, "And you threw him against your car because he was walking in his own neighborhood." Gregory had no defense to offer and no excuse that would make any sense. And the truth of what he had done sat in his chest like a heavy stone that made it hard to breathe or think or do anything except sit there and accept the consequences. "Sir, he gave me his card," Gregory finally said, and held up the business card to show the captain and added he said if I wanted to learn and be better I should call him. "He did," Captain Morris said, and for the first time his expression softened slightly with something that might have been surprise or hope, and he continued saying, "That is more grace than you deserve, Palmer, and you know that, right?" "Yes, sir," Gregory replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "The commissioner wants you fired, and Internal Affairs is opening an investigation, and the media is camped outside, demanding answers, and you are suspended without pay. Effective immediately," Captain Morris said as he stood up and walked to the window where he could see the news vans parked on the street below. "But Lawrence Hughes called me an hour ago," the captain added, and Gregory's head snapped up in surprise. "He said he does not want you terminated, and he said everyone deserves a chance to be better. And he has offered to work with you personally to help you understand what you did wrong and how to fix it." The captain continued, and turned back to face Gregory with an expression that was hard to read. "I do not understand why he is giving you this chance," Captain Morris said slowly, and added, "But I suggest you do not waste it, because opportunities like this do not come twice." Gregory left the precinct through a back door to avoid the reporters and drove home in a daze with his mind racing through everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. That night, he sat in his small apartment staring at Lawrence's business card, and the card was simple and elegant with just a name and title and phone number, but it represented so much more than that. There was nothing on the card about the FBI or about Lawrence's decades of service or about all the lives he had saved and all the criminals he had caught and all the good he had done in the world. And Gregory realized that was the point. Lawrence did not need to advertise his accomplishments or prove his worth to anyone because he knew who he was and what he had done. And he did not define himself by his career or his awards but by his character and his values. Gregory picked up his phone with trembling hands and dialed the number on the card before he could change his mind or talk himself out of it. The phone rang 3 times and Gregory almost hung up, but then Lawrence answered with a simple hello that sounded neither angry nor welcoming, but just neutral and waiting. "Mr. Hughes, this is Gregory Palmer," Gregory said, and his voice shook slightly. As he continued, "I want to learn and I want to be better, and I am calling because you gave me a chance I do not deserve, but I want to take it, if you are still willing." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Gregory held his breath, wondering if Lawrence had changed his mind or decided that Gregory was not worth the effort. "Come to my apartment tomorrow morning at 9, Lawrence finally said, and gave Gregory the address, and added, "Bring a notebook and be prepared to listen and learn because this will not be easy." Gregory agreed and thanked Lawrence and hung up the phone and then sat there for a long time, thinking about what tomorrow would bring, and whether he had the courage to face his own failures and biases, and become the kind of officer and person he should have been all along. Lawrence Hughes lived in a modest apartment, despite having earned enough money from his FBI career and consulting work to afford something much more luxurious, but he had never been interested in showing off his wealth or status because those things did not matter to him as much as living a simple and meaningful life. And when Gregory arrived the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Lawrence opened the door with 2 cups of coffee already prepared. The apartment was filled with books and photographs and mementos from a lifetime of service, and Gregory noticed a picture of a young Lawrence in his first FBI uniform, with his face bright with hope and determination, and it reminded him of how he had felt when he first joined the police force before everything got complicated and confusing. "Sit down," Lawrence said as he gestured to a comfortable chair and added, "Tell me your story, and how you became a police officer and why you wanted to do this work." Gregory had not expected the question because he thought Lawrence would lecture him, or yell at him or tell him what a terrible person he was, but instead, Lawrence wanted to hear his story and understand where he came from. For the next hour, Gregory talked about growing up in a working-class neighborhood and watching his father struggle after losing his job, and wanting to make a difference in the world and help people who needed help. He talked about the police academy and his dreams of protecting people and serving his community, and somewhere along the way, his voice broke because he realized how far he had strayed from those original dreams. Lawrence listened without interrupting, and his expression was thoughtful and patient, like he had all the time in the world to sit and listen to this young officer pour out his heart. "Good intentions," Lawrence finally said and added, "That is what I hear in your story, and good intentions that got twisted somewhere along the way, and now we need to figure out how that happened, and how to fix it. I do not know when it started," Gregory admitted, and continued saying, "I just started seeing threats everywhere and started profiling people without realizing it, and it became automatic like breathing. Let me tell you about my first year in the FBI," Lawrence said as he settled back in his chair and began a story that would change Gregory's understanding of everything. "It was 1979, and I was 25 years old, fresh out of training, and assigned to a field office in Mississippi, which was not an easy place for a young black FBI agent in those days. "You know what my training officer told me on my first day?" Lawrence asked, and Gregory shook his head. "He said, 'Hughes, you are going to see things that make you angry, and you will encounter racism from suspects and from witnesses, and sometimes from your own colleagues, and the question is whether you let that anger make you better or make you bitter.'" Lawrence stood and walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a worn journal filled with pages of neat handwriting that documented decades of cases and lessons learned. "I kept a journal throughout my career," Lawrence explained, and added, "Every case and every lesson is recorded here, and let me read you something from 1982. He found the page and read aloud, saying, "Today, I arrested a white supremacist who had murdered 3 people, and he spit in my face and called me things I will not repeat. But when we booked him, and when I read him his rights, I did it with dignity, and not for him but for me, because the moment I let hatred change how I do my job, I become part of the problem." Gregory felt his eyes burning with tears that he tried to hold back. "You want to know the difference between us?" Lawrence asked as he closed the journal and continued saying, "It is not that I never made mistakes, because God knows I did, and I made plenty of them. But the difference is that I learned to see people and really see them, and not as categories or threats or statistics, but as human beings with their own stories and struggles." "How do I learn that?" Gregory asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "You already took the first step by coming here," Lawrence replied and added, "but the second step is harder, because I am going to give you homework, and real homework, and you are going to learn the history you never learned in school and meet people and hear their stories and do ride-alongs with me." "Ride-alongs," Gregory repeated with confusion and added, "But you are retired." Lawrence smiled for the first time since Gregory had arrived, and it transformed his face, making him look younger. "I may be retired from the FBI, but I still consult with community organizations," Lawrence explained and continued saying, "and you are going to see what policing looks like when it is done right, and when it is done with respect and understanding and compassion." He handed Gregory a book and a list of names and addresses. "Start with these readings," Lawrence said and added, "and then we will begin the real work of changing how you see the world and the people in it." 3 weeks into his education with Lawrence Gregory, Palmer had learned more than in his entire 3 years on the police force, and it was not just academic learning from books but experiential learning that came from meeting people and hearing their stories and seeing the world through their eyes instead of through his own limited perspective. Lawrence did not just lecture him or tell him what to think, but instead immersed Gregory in experiences that shattered every assumption he had held about crime and policing and the communities he was supposed to serve. The first assignment was the hardest because Lawrence took him to the South Side, to neighborhoods Gregory had patrolled before, but had never really seen or understood beyond the statistics and crime reports. They sat in a community center where Lawrence volunteered, And Gregory listened to story after story from people whose lives had been shaped by interactions with police officers who made assumptions just like he had made. A teenager named Andre talked about being stopped 17 times in 2 years and always questioned and always suspected, despite having never committed a crime. And his voice shook with frustration as he described what it felt like to be treated like a criminal, just for existing. An elderly woman named Claire described watching her grandson get arrested for standing on his own front porch because an officer did not believe he lived there, and she cried as she told the story of how traumatized her grandson had been by the experience. A business owner named Peter explained how he had been handcuffed in front of his own store because an officer did not believe he was the owner, despite the sign above the door bearing his name and the keys in his hand. Each story felt like a punch to Gregory's gut because he recognized himself in the officers they described, and he saw his own actions reflected back at him through their pain and anger. Mr. Hughes, Andre said during a break and asked, "Why are you helping him after what he did to you?" And everyone in the room turned to look at Lawrence, waiting for his answer. Lawrence looked at Gregory before answering, and the young officer sat with his head down, clearly struggling with shame and regret. "Because hatred never fixed hatred," Lawrence said simply, and continued saying, "because I have seen too many good people make bad choices, and too many bad situations make good people question themselves. And Gregory made a mistake. But if we do not give people a chance to grow and learn and be better, then we are just perpetuating a cycle of anger and misunderstanding." The next week, Lawrence arranged something unprecedented as he took Gregory to meet retired officers from across the city, who were men and women of all backgrounds, and who had spent decades building trust in their communities through patience and respect. Commander Patricia Lewis was a 40-year veteran who had worked in some of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago and had never once fired her weapon in 4 decades of service. "You know how I survived?" she asked Gregory, and answered her own question, saying, "By remembering that every person I encountered was somebody's child, and somebody's parent, and somebody's friend, and by choosing to see their humanity first, and their potential threat second." Sergeant Henry Kim talked about growing up as a Korean immigrant in the 1960s and facing discrimination from both the public and fellow officers, and how he had dedicated his career to proving that respect and understanding were more powerful tools than fear and force. Each conversation opened Gregory's eyes wider to the reality that his failure was not just about one incident with Lawrence, but was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to serve and protect. One evening, Lawrence took Gregory to a neighborhood barbecue in the same area where Gregory had made his fateful stop, and people recognized him immediately, and the tension was thick in the air like a storm about to break. "Why did you bring him here?" a woman asked Lawrence, and her voice was sharp with distrust and anger. "Because he is learning," Lawrence said simply, and added, "and because I believe in second chances, and I believe people can change if they are willing to do the hard work." Gregory did not hide behind Lawrence or make excuses for what he had done, but instead he listened when people wanted to talk, and acknowledged their anger when they expressed it, and admitted he did not know if he could change, but he was trying. When people questioned whether someone like him could really change, he did not get defensive, but instead agreed that he understood their doubts because he had doubted himself too. By the end of the evening, something had shifted among the crowd, and it was not forgiveness exactly, but it was a willingness to see that Gregory was genuinely trying to understand and learn from his mistake. As they walked back to Lawrence's car, Gregory spoke quietly and said, "I do not know if I can ever make this right. You cannot change the past." Lawrence agreed and continued saying, "But you can choose who you become, and that choice, Gregory, is the only thing that matters now, because the past is fixed, but the future is still unwritten, and you get to decide what kind of officer and what kind of person you will be from this moment forward." 2 months into his suspension and his education with Lawrence, Gregory received an unexpected phone call from Captain Morris, and the captain's voice was urgent in a way that made Gregory's heart race with anxiety about what might be coming next. "Palmer, I need you to come to the precinct," the captain said, and added, "Bring Lawrence Hughes if he is willing, because we have a situation that requires both of your help." Gregory's mind raced with possibilities as he wondered if they had decided to fire him or if something else had happened, but he called Lawrence and they drove to the precinct together in silence. When they arrived, Captain Morris led them to a conference room where several FBI agents were waiting, along with the police commissioner Helen Rodriguez and the head of the city's gang intelligence unit. Lawrence, one of the FBI agents, said as he stood to shake hands and added, "It has been too long and we need your help with something urgent." Agent Nathan Cross explained the situation, which involved a major gang operation, planning something big, but they had gone dark, and traditional surveillance was not working anymore. They needed someone who could get into the community and build trust and gather intelligence without raising suspicion or alerting the gang members to the investigation. "Why are you telling me this?" Gregory asked, because he was confused about why he was present for this high-level meeting. Lawrence turned to him, and the look in his eyes was appraising and testing, like he was deciding whether Gregory was ready for what was coming next. "Because I recommended you," Lawrence said simply, and added, "I told them about the work you have been doing and about how you have been learning to actually see the community, instead of just patrolling it." What Gregory said, because he could not believe what he was hearing. "The gang leader's younger brother is in one of the community programs where you have been volunteering." Captain Morris explained and continued saying, "The kid named Marcus has been talking about you and about how you are different from other cops and how you actually listen to him." Gregory remembered Marcus, who was a quiet 17-year-old, who had been standoffish at first but had slowly started to open up over the past few weeks. They had talked about basketball and about college, and about Marcus's dreams of becoming an engineer, and Gregory had never pushed or tried to extract information, but had just been present and respectful and genuinely interested in the young man's life. "We need someone Marcus trusts to help us reach him." Agent Cross continued and added, to convince him that we can protect him if he tells us what his brother is planning, because lives are at stake here. Gregory looked at Lawrence, feeling uncertain, because this was exactly the kind of situation where he might have made mistakes before, and where his old assumptions might have led him to pressure Marcus and see him only as a tool for information rather than as a person. "What do you think I should do?" Gregory asked Lawrence directly. "I think you should remember everything you have learned," Lawrence replied, and continued saying, "Marcus is not a source or an informant, but a scared kid caught between loyalty to his brother and knowing what is right, and if you approach him as a human being first and as someone who cares about his well-being, then maybe you can help him make the right choice." Over the next week, Gregory worked with Lawrence to develop an approach that was not an interrogation strategy, but a genuine effort to help Marcus navigate an impossible situation. They met at the community center in public, with no pressure and no hidden agenda. Marcus, Gregory said on their third meeting, and added, "I need to be honest with you about something because I respect you too much to lie." The teenager tensed immediately because he had been waiting for this moment and waiting for the other shoe to drop, just like it always did with police officers. "I know your brother is planning something," Gregory continued, and added something that could hurt a lot of people, "and I know you know about it too. But I am not here to threaten you or pressure you, because I am here because I care about what happens to you, and because you are worth more than being caught in the middle of your brother's choices." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, and for the next hour he talked about his brother's descent into gang life, and about the plans for a coordinated attack on a rival gang's territory, and about his own fear and guilt. "I want to stop it," Marcus finally said, and added, "But if I tell, then my brother goes to prison and my family will hate me and I will be alone." Lawrence, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up, and his voice carried the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. "Marcus, I have been doing this work for a very long time," Lawrence said, and continued, "and I can tell you that the hardest choices are usually the right ones, and your brother made his decisions, but you have a chance to save lives, and maybe even save him, because if this attack happens, people will die, and maybe your brother will be one of them. But if you help stop it now, there is a chance for him to face justice and eventually find redemption." The information Marcus provided that day prevented a gang war that could have killed dozens of innocent people, and his brother was arrested, but lives were saved. Marcus was placed in protective custody with a scholarship fund set up by Lawrence himself to ensure the young man's dreams of college could still come true, despite the difficult choice he had made to do the right thing. The success of the operation did not erase Gregory's past actions, but it did create an unexpected opportunity for change within the department, and Commissioner Rodriguez called both Gregory and Lawrence to her office a week later. "The department is facing a crisis of trust," she said bluntly, and continued, "not just from the incident with Officer Palmer, but from years of broken relationships between police and communities of color, and I want to change that starting now." She pulled up a presentation on her screen showing statistics on police interactions and community complaints, and the growing divide between law enforcement and the people they were supposed to serve. "Lawrence, I want you to develop a training," Program Commissioner Rodriguez said, and added a real program and not just a checkbox exercise, "and I want every officer in this department to go through what Gregory has been through and to learn what you taught him." Lawrence leaned back, considering the magnitude of what she was asking, because this was not a small task, but a complete overhaul of how officers were trained and how they thought about their work. "That is a big undertaking," Lawrence said carefully, and added it would require resources and time, and a genuine commitment from the top down to make real changes. "You have all three," Commissioner Rodriguez assured him and continued, "and I want Gregory to be part of it and to share his story and to show that change is possible, even for officers who have made serious mistakes." Gregory felt his throat tighten, because the idea of standing in front of his peers and admitting his failures and sharing the humiliation of his mistakes terrified him more than anything he had ever faced. "I do not know if I can do that," Gregory admitted quietly. "You can," Lawrence said firmly, and added, "because your story is not just about failure but about growth, and about having the courage to admit when you are wrong and the strength to change, and that is what other officers need to see." 3 months later, the Chicago Police Department launched the Community Trust Initiative, which was a comprehensive program designed by Lawrence that combined classroom education with community immersion and personal reflection. Every officer would spend time in the neighborhoods they served, not as enforcers looking for crime, but as listeners and learners trying to understand the people whose lives they affected every day. The inaugural session began with Gregory standing at a podium facing 200 officers, and his hands shook as he gripped the sides of the lectern. Behind him, a screen showed the viral video of his encounter with Lawrence, and he made himself watch it, and made himself see the moment that had changed everything. 3 months ago, I was that officer," Gregory began, and his voice wavered as he continued. "I saw an elderly black man and immediately assumed he was a threat, and I never asked myself why, and I never questioned my assumptions, and I just acted on bias I did not even know I had." The room was silent, and some officers looked uncomfortable, while others looked angry, and a few leaned forward with genuine interest in what he had to say. "What I did not know was that the man I assaulted had spent 32 years in the FBI and had saved countless lives and had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting people." Gregory paused, gathering his courage, and added, "But here is what I should have known, and that information should not have mattered, because I should have treated him with dignity and respect, whether he was an FBI legend or a homeless person on the street." He went on to describe his journey with Lawrence and the community meetings and the stories he had heard, and the moment-by-moment unlearning of bias and relearning of what it meant to truly serve. "I am not standing here to say I am fixed," Gregory said near the end, and continued, "I am standing here to say I am trying, and every day I am trying to be better and to see people as people first, and to understand that the badge I wear is a responsibility and not a license for prejudice." When he finished, there was a long moment of silence, and then slowly, Lawrence Hughes stood from his seat in the back of the room, and he began to clap. Others joined him, and not everyone, but enough to show that the message had resonated with at least some of the officers in the room. After the presentation, officers lined up to talk to both Gregory and Lawrence, and some were defensive, arguing that profiling was just good police work and necessary for safety, but others admitted their own doubts and their own moments of bias, and their desire to do better even if they did not know how. One older officer who Gregory had always admired approached him with tears in his eyes. "I have been doing this job for 20 years, the officer said, and added, "and I have made the same mistakes you did, and more times than I want to admit, and thank you for having the courage to talk about it and for showing us there is another way to do this work." 1 year after the incident that changed his life, Gregory Palmer stood in the same neighborhood where he had assaulted Lawrence Hughes, but everything was different now. He was back on active duty, but assigned to a community policing unit that Lawrence had helped design, and instead of patrolling in a car looking for threats, Gregory walked the streets and knew the shop owners by name, and knew the kids who played basketball at the park, and knew the elderly residents who sat on their porches in the evening. Most importantly, they knew him, and not just as the officer from the video, though some still remembered, but as someone who had demonstrated day after day that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work. The Community Trust Initiative, had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and what started as a training program for Chicago police had attracted attention from departments across the country who were desperate to repair their relationships with the communities they served. Lawrence had become a sought-after consultant traveling to cities all over America to share his wisdom. But he always made time for Gregory because their weekly meetings had become a constant and a chance for reflection and continued growth. On this particular evening, they sat in Lawrence's apartment, reviewing case files from the department's new bias response team that Gregory had become part of, using his experience to help other officers recognize and correct their own prejudices. "I got a letter today," Gregory said as he pulled an envelope from his jacket and added from Marcus. Lawrence smiled because Marcus had started college 2 months ago studying engineering as he had dreamed, and his brother was serving time but had been accepted into a rehabilitation program with a chance at a reduced sentence for cooperation and genuine reform. "What does he say?" Lawrence asked. Gregory opened the letter and his eyes scanned the careful handwriting as Marcus described his classes and his new friends and his hope for the future. But it was the last paragraph that made Gregory's voice catch as he read aloud. "Officer Palmer, you showed me that people can change and that mistakes do not have to define us, and because of you and Mr. Hughes, I believe in second chances, and not just for my brother, but for myself. And thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving." Lawrence nodded slowly because in the year since the incident, he had seen remarkable transformation, and not just in Gregory, but in dozens of officers who had gone through the program, and the change was not universal because there were still those who resisted and who clung to old ways, but there was movement and there was progress. "Do you remember what I told you that first night?" Lawrence asked and added, "when you called my number." Gregory thought back to that phone call and to his shaking hands and terrified voice. "You said everyone has a story and that everyone has worth." Gregory replied. "And do you believe that now?" Lawrence asked and added, "Really believe it?" Gregory looked out the window at the neighborhood below, and he saw people going about their lives and each one carrying their own history and their own struggles and their own dreams, and where once he might have seen potential threats, now he saw humanity. "Yes," Gregory said simply and added, "I do." Lawrence stood and walked to his wall of photographs, and he pointed to one Gregory had never really examined, before showing a much younger Lawrence in his FBI uniform standing next to an older white officer. "That is Agent Walter Brennan," Lawrence said, and added, "my training officer and the one who taught me about anger and choice, and he was from Alabama and grew up in a segregated town and was taught from childhood to see people like me as less than human." Gregory looked at the photograph more closely, and the two men in it were smiling with genuine affection, evident in their body language. Walter could have let his upbringing define him, Lawrence continued, but instead he chose to be better. And he became my mentor and my friend, and when he died I was the one who spoke at his funeral, and his last words to me were, "Pass it on, Lawrence, and teach others what I taught you." The weight of that legacy settled over the room, because this was not just about one incident or one officer or one city, but about breaking cycles that had persisted for generations, and about choosing again and again to see the humanity in others. "I want you to do something for me," Lawrence said as he turned back to Gregory and added, "I want you to make a promise." "Anything," Gregory replied. 20 years from now, when you are the one with experience and wisdom, and when some young officer makes a terrible mistake, I want you to remember this moment," Lawrence said and continued, "and I want you to give them the same chance I gave you, and to teach them and to believe in their capacity for change, just like I believed in yours." Gregory stood and extended his hand, but Lawrence pulled him into a hug, and it was the embrace of a teacher and student, and of a mentor and protege, and of two men who had found something unexpected in each other. "I promise," Gregory said and added, "I will pass it on." Years later, when journalists would ask Lawrence Hughes about the incident and its aftermath, he would always say the same thing, that he did not do it for recognition or praise, but because he had been given chances himself, and because he believed in the possibility of redemption, and because he knew that real change did not come from anger or punishment, but from patience and understanding, and the unwavering belief that people could be better than their worst moments. And Gregory Palmer, once an officer who could not see past his own biases, became living proof of that belief as he became the kind of officer and the kind of man who saw people first, and who understood that everyone had a story, and who knew that the badge he wore was a sacred trust and not a license for prejudice. The viral video of that rainy night still existed and still circulated occasionally on social media, but now it came with a different narrative, and not just the story of a mistake, but the story of what came after and the story of an FBI legend who chose mercy over vengeance, and the story of a young officer who chose growth over ego, and the story of a community that witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. Most importantly, it became a story of hope because if Gregory Palmer could change, and if Lawrence Hughes could forgive, and if a city could heal, then perhaps anything was possible, and that in the end was the greatest legacy of all.